Before there were nations called the United States or Brazil, before plantations stretched across the Americas, before the Atlantic Ocean became a highway of commerce, there was a system so vast, so organized, and so brutal that it would reshape continents. Between the 1500s and the 1800s, an estimated 12.5 million Africans were forcibly taken from their homes and transported across the Atlantic Ocean. It remains one of the largest forced migrations in human history. But numbers alone cannot tell this story. To understand it, we have to begin on the shores of West and Central Africa. In the early 16th century, European empires were expanding. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean demanded labor. Gold and silver mines in South America demanded labor. Tobacco fields in North America demanded labor. The demand seemed endless. European traders, primarily from Portugal, Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands, established trading posts along the African coast. Some African leaders, navigating their own political rivalries and pressures, became involved in trading captives. Others resisted fiercely. What followed was not chaos. It was an organized network. Ships arrived carrying textiles, firearms, and manufactured goods. They departed carrying human beings, men, women, children, bound for lands they had never seen. This triangular trade would connect Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a cycle of profit built on human suffering. The first stage began with capture. Some were taken during wars between African states. Others were kidnapped in raids. Families were separated in an instant. Villages were destabilized. Entire regions were reshaped by the constant threat of violence. Those captured were marched sometimes hundreds of miles to coastal forts, and then came the waiting. Inside, holding cells near the shore, captives were confined in cramped, dark spaces. Disease spread icily. Fear spread faster. For many, this was the last time they would ever see their homeland. When the ships were ready, they were forced aboard. This journey across the Atlantic became known as the Middle Passage. Conditions were devastating. People were packed tightly below deck, chained together with barely enough room to move. Sanitation was nearly non-existent. Illness moved quickly through the holds of the ships. Resistance was met with punishment. Historians estimate that nearly 2 million Africans died during the crossing alone, and yet the ships kept sailing. For the traders, this was business. For the captives, it was survival. Some resisted in any way they could, refusing food, attempting rebellion, holding on to fragments of language and song. Even in unimaginable conditions, humanity persisted. When ships finally reached the Americas, the ordeal did not end. Survivors were inspected and sold at auctions. Families were separated again. Names were replaced. Identities were stripped. The majority were sent to Brazil and the Caribbean, where sugar plantations demanded relentless labor. Others were taken to Spanish colonies, French islands, and eventually British North America. Over centuries, this system generated enormous wealth. Sugar, cotton, tobacco, and rice transformed global markets. European ports flourished. Insurance companies, banks, and shipping industries expanded. Entire economies were built around enslaved labor, but the human cost was immeasurable. Communities in Africa were depopulated. Political structures shifted. Generations grew up shaped by loss. In the Americas, enslaved Africans and their descendants endured forced labor, violence, and the denial of basic human rights. Yet they also carried culture, knowledge, music, spirituality, agricultural skill, and resistance. They built societies even as they were denied freedom within them. The transatlantic slave trade was not a single nation's project. It was global. Portuguese ships dominated early routes. British traders later transported more enslaved Africans than any other nation. French merchants supplied Caribbean plantations. Spanish colonies depended on enslaved labor. American merchants and shipbuilders participated as well. It was a system maintained by laws, contracts, investments, and political protection. And yet, it was never uncontested. Resistance occurred at every stage. There were revolts aboard ships. There were uprisings on plantations. There were maroon communities formed by those who escaped into forests and mountains. There were abolitionists, black and white, who demanded an end to the trade. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, opposition to the slave trade grew louder. Britain outlawed the transatlantic slave trade in 1807. The United States followed in 1808, though illegal trafficking continued for decades. Other European nations eventually passed bans as well. But ending the trade did not end slavery itself. In many regions, slavery persisted until the mid to late 19th century. Brazil abolished it in 1888, one of the last countries in the Americas to do so. By then, the Atlantic world had been permanently transformed, demographically, economically, culturally, today. Millions of people across the Americas trace their ancestry to those who survived the Middle Passage. African traditions shaped music, language, religion, food, and art throughout the Western Hemisphere. The legacy of the transatlantic slave trade still influences conversations about race, inequality, and justice. It is not distant history. It is foundational history. Understanding this system requires confronting uncomfortable truths, that global prosperity was built, in part, on exploitation, that governments protected it, that ordinary people participated in it, that resistance never fully disappeared. 12.5 million embarked. Roughly 10 million survived the crossing, each one a life disrupted, a story interrupted, a future rewritten. The transatlantic slave trade was not inevitable. It was constructed. Because it was constructed, it can be studied, understood, and remembered. History does not change what happened, but it changes how we understand it. And understanding is where responsibility begins.